In the heaviness of a stifling dawn, a rich man drives his black car down a dirt road enclosed by the forest. In the back seat, a girl holds a thin blanket, not understanding the distance from home. The car stops near a shed hidden among vines, and the man opens the door without looking back. Within the woods, a black panther fixes its eyes on the fragile body. A German shepherd emerges from between the branches, scarred by abandonment. The car's engine fades around the bend, taking any help with it. In the silence, the panther moves towards the dog. But what happens next, no one will ever know. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now back to our story. The humid North Carolina night pressed down like a heavy blanket as William Thornton's black Mercedes navigated the winding dirt road that cut through the Thornton Wildlife Reserve. The headlights carved a narrow path through the dense forest, illuminating ancient oaks and towering pines that had stood for generations. In the back seat, 8-year-old Sarah clutched a thin blanket, her eyes wide with confusion as she tried to understand why she had been awakened from her sleep and taken from the familiar comfort of her grandmother's house. William's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles white in the dim glow of the dashboard. The reserve had been his pet project for over a decade, a 1,000-acre sanctuary that he had established to rehabilitate his public image after several business scandals had tarnished his reputation. To the outside world, William Thornton was a philanthropist, a successful businessman who cared deeply about wildlife conservation and environmental protection. The local newspapers regularly featured stories about his generous donations to various causes, and his name adorned plaques at the Children's Hospital and the community center. But tonight, as he drove deeper into the heart of his own preserve, William felt the weight of secrets that threatened to crush him. The reserve served multiple purposes beyond wildlife conservation, and some of those purposes would destroy him if they ever came to light. He had built his fortune through a series of questionable real estate deals, manipulating zoning laws, and bribing local officials to approve developments that should never have been permitted. The Wildlife Reserve was his insurance policy, a way to launder money and create a legitimate front for his less savory business activities. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her small voice breaking the oppressive silence. "Mr. Thornton, where are we going? I want to go back to Grandma's house." Her voice carried a tremor of fear that made William's chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. He had known Sarah since she was a baby, had watched her grow from a toddling child into the bright, curious little girl she had become. Her mother, Jessica, had worked for his company for several years before she disappeared under mysterious circumstances 2 years ago. "We're just taking a little trip, sweetheart," William said, his voice carefully controlled. "There's something I need to show you." The lie tasted bitter in his mouth, but he pushed forward. He had no choice. Recent events had forced his hand, and Sarah had become an unexpected complication in his carefully orchestrated plans. The road narrowed as they approached the heart of the reserve, where William had built a series of storage buildings disguised as research facilities. To visitors and environmental inspectors, they appeared to be legitimate structures used for wildlife monitoring and veterinary care. In reality, they served as temporary storage for various items that William preferred to keep away from prying eyes. Documents, computer equipment, and other evidence of his illegal activities found temporary homes in these remote buildings before being permanently disposed of. As the Mercedes rounded a bend, the headlights illuminated a weathered wooden building, nearly swallowed by climbing vines and undergrowth. William brought the car to a stop and sat for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Through the open windows, the sounds of the forest filtered in, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, and the ever-present buzz of insects that thrived in the humid southern night. Sarah peered out the window at the shadowy building, her young mind trying to process the unfamiliar surroundings. "This place looks scary, Mr. Thornton. Can we go home now?" Her voice had grown smaller, and William could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. He had always prided himself on being able to compartmentalize his emotions, to make difficult decisions without letting feelings cloud his judgment. But looking at Sarah's frightened face, he felt something crack inside his carefully constructed emotional armor. William stepped out of the car and walked around to open Sarah's door. The humid air hit him like a wall, carrying the rich scents of earth and vegetation. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint sound of running water from the creek that meandered through the property. "Come on, Sarah, just for a few minutes, and then we'll figure out what to do next." As Sarah climbed out of the car, clutching her blanket tightly, William noticed movement in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, his heart stopped as he considered the possibility that someone had followed them. But then he realized it was probably just one of the many wild animals that called the reserve home. Over the years, the property had become a genuine sanctuary for various species, including several that had been injured or orphaned and subsequently released into the protected environment. The building before them had once been a legitimate research station back when William had first established the reserve with genuine intentions. Dr. Margaret Chen, a wildlife biologist from the university, had used it as a base for her studies on local bird populations. But as William's business empire had grown more complex and his methods more questionable, he had gradually phased out the legitimate research activities and repurposed the facilities for his own needs. Sarah took a tentative step toward the building, her small hand finding William's larger one. Despite everything, she still trusted him, still saw him as the family friend who had brought her presents on her birthday and taken her to the ice cream parlor on special occasions. William squeezed her hand gently, fighting back the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the circle of light cast by the car's headlights came the sound of rustling leaves. William tensed, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The reserve was home to numerous species of wildlife, including black bears, wildcats, and various predatory birds. During his years of managing the property, he had encountered most of them at one time or another, and he knew that while attacks on humans were rare, they were not unheard of. "Mr. Thornton," Sarah whispered, pressing closer to his side, "I heard something." Her voice was barely audible above the chorus of night sounds that surrounded them. William placed a protective arm around her small shoulders, his own senses heightened as he listened for any indication of danger. The sound came again, closer this time, and William caught a glimpse of reflected light from what appeared to be eyes watching them from the undergrowth. His first instinct was to hustle Sarah back into the car and drive away immediately, but he forced himself to remain calm. Panic would only make the situation worse, and he needed to think clearly about his next move. As they stood there in the humid night air, Sarah looking up at him with complete trust and dependence, William felt the full weight of his actions settling on his shoulders. He had always been able to justify his questionable business practices by telling himself that he was just playing the game by the same rules as everyone else. But standing here with an innocent child who depended on him for safety, he couldn't escape the reality of what he had become. The reserve that he had created as a symbol of his redemption had instead become the stage for his greatest moral failing. The eyes in the darkness seemed to be studying them, evaluating whether they posed a threat or represented an opportunity. William's mind raced as he considered his options, knowing that whatever decision he made in the next few moments would have consequences that would ripple through many lives for years to come. From the shadows emerged a figure that made William's breath catch in his throat. A large German shepherd, its coat scarred and matted from years of surviving in the wild, stepped into the pale circle of light cast by the Mercedes headlights. The dog's intelligent brown eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that was both protective and gentle, as if recognizing something in the frightened child that resonated with his own experience of abandonment. William recognized the animal immediately. 3 years ago, when his business troubles had first begun to spiral out of control, he had made the difficult decision to abandon his family's pet rather than face the expense and complication of caring for him during the turbulent times ahead. Max had been Sarah's mother's dog, originally, a loyal companion who had lived with Jessica's family before circumstances had forced difficult choices upon everyone involved. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the sight of the magnificent animal. Despite his rough appearance, there was something undeniably noble about the way he carried himself, his head held high and his stance alert but non-threatening. "He's beautiful," she whispered, her fear momentarily forgotten in the presence of this unexpected guardian. The German shepherd approached slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. As he drew closer, Sarah could see the numerous scars that crisscrossed. His dark coat, evidence of his struggles to survive in the wilderness. But his eyes remained kind, filled with an intelligence that seemed to understand her situation better than any human could. "Easy, boy," William said quietly, though he could see that the dog posed no immediate threat to Sarah. If anything, the animal seemed drawn to protect her, positioning himself between the child and the darkness that surrounded them. William felt a pang of guilt as he remembered the day he had driven Max deep into the reserve and left him to fend for himself, telling himself that the dog would be better off in the wild than in the chaotic mess his life had become. As if summoned by some primal instinct, another presence made itself known from the depths of the forest. The sleek black form of a panther emerged from behind a massive oak tree, its movements fluid and graceful despite the obvious power contained within its muscular frame. The big cat's golden eyes reflected the car's headlights like two small suns, and its attention was focused entirely on the small group gathered around the weathered building. Max immediately positioned himself more protectively in front of Sarah, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat. The sound was not aggressive, but rather a clear warning that he would defend the child at any cost. The panther paused in its approach, its predatory instincts warring with something else, some recognition of the complex dynamics playing out before it. Sarah pressed closer to William, her small hand gripping his jacket with surprising strength. "Mr. Thornton, what do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Despite her fear, there was something in her tone that suggested she trusted him to keep her safe, a faith that made William's chest tighten with emotion. The panther had been another of William's carefully hidden secrets. 2 years ago, when a traveling circus had gone bankrupt after a series of unfortunate events, William had quietly purchased several of the animals through a complex network of intermediaries. Most had been relocated to legitimate sanctuaries, but Luna, the Black Panther, had proven too aggressive for most facilities. Rather than face the scrutiny that would come with proper placement, William had brought her to his reserve, where she had gradually adapted to life in the semi-wild environment. Luna represented another layer of William's complicated relationship with the truth. To the outside world, he was a successful businessman and philanthropist who supported wildlife conservation. In reality, he had accumulated a growing collection of secrets that he kept hidden within the boundaries of his 1,000-acre property. The panther was just one of many things that would raise uncomfortable questions if discovered by the wrong people. Max's protective stance seemed to have a calming effect on Luna, who settled into a crouch at the edge of the clearing. Her powerful, Muscles relaxed but ready to spring into action if necessary, the three species regarded each other warily, each recognizing the others as intelligent beings worthy of respect rather than simple threats to be eliminated. William found himself caught between admiration and anxiety as he watched the silent communication taking place between the animals. Max's scarred coat told the story of his years in the wilderness, his survival against predators, and the elements a testament to his intelligence and determination. Luna's presence added an element of barely controlled wildness to the situation, her predatory nature held in check by some instinct that recognized the innocence of the child she observed. "They're not going to hurt me, are they?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a note of wonder alongside her natural fear. Despite the potentially dangerous situation, she seemed to sense that both animals were more interested in protecting her than threatening her. "I don't think so," William replied honestly, though he remained ready to sweep Sarah into his arms and retreat to the safety of the car at the first sign of aggression from either animal. "They seem to understand that you're just a little girl who needs help." The observation struck William with unexpected force. Here were two wild animals, each capable of causing serious harm, who seemed instinctively drawn to protect an innocent child. Meanwhile, he himself, supposedly civilized and educated, had brought that same child to this remote location with intentions that he couldn't even fully acknowledge to himself. As the minutes passed and strange equilibrium settled over the clearing, Max maintained his protective position near Sarah, occasionally glancing back to ensure she remained safe while keeping his primary attention focused on Luna. The panther seemed content to observe from her position at the edge of the light, her golden eyes moving between the humans and the dog with an intelligence that suggested she was evaluating the entire situation. Sarah's initial fear began to give way to fascination as she watched the two animals. "The doggy looks hungry," she observed, her childish compassion overriding her concern for her own safety. "And sad too, like he's been lost for a long time." Her words hit William like a physical blow. She had identified exactly what he had been trying to ignore for 3 years. Max was hungry and sad and lost, and William was directly responsible for his condition. The successful businessman who prided himself on making difficult decisions without emotional interference found himself struggling with feelings he had spent years suppressing. "Maybe we should give him some food," Sarah suggested, her young mind already working on solutions to the problems she observed. "Do you have anything in your car, Mr. Thornton?" William realized that he did indeed have some emergency supplies in the Mercedes, including a few energy bars and a bottle of water. It wouldn't be much for an animal of Max's size, but it would be something. More importantly, it would give him a reason to move slowly and carefully, maintaining the delicate balance that seemed to have developed between the various inhabitants of the clearing. As he walked slowly back to the car, William became aware of sounds in the distance that hadn't been there when they first arrived. The rumble of an engine, still far away but growing gradually closer. Someone else was approaching the reserve, and at this hour of the night, that could only mean one thing. His carefully orchestrated plans were beginning to unravel, and the presence of Sarah, Max, and Luna added complications he hadn't anticipated. The headlights of the approaching vehicle became visible through the trees, and William felt his pulse quicken. Everything he had worked to build and protect was about to be put to the test, and the stakes had never been higher. In the clearing behind him, a scared little girl found comfort in the protection of a dog he had abandoned and observed by a panther that represented his hidden secrets. William realized that the choices he made in the next few minutes would determine not just his own future, but the futures of all the innocent lives that had become entangled in his web of deception. Bobby Hayes had been the caretaker of the Thornton Wildlife Reserve for 8 years, and in that time, he had developed an almost supernatural sense for when something was wrong on the property. Tonight, as he sat in his small cabin on the eastern edge of the reserve, that sense was screaming at him like a smoke alarm. The muffled sound of barking that had drifted through his open window wasn't the usual call of coyotes or the territorial disputes of the resident fox population. This was different, more urgent, and it had come from the direction of the old research building that Mr. Thornton had told him to avoid. Bobby was a man of simple habits and complicated observations. At 53, he had spent most of his adult life working outdoors, first as a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains, and later as a private caretaker for wealthy landowners who wanted to maintain large properties without the hassle of daily management. The Thornton Reserve had been his longest assignment, and over the years he had grown genuinely fond of the diverse ecosystem that thrived within its boundaries. But Bobby was also a man who paid attention to details, and those details had been painting an increasingly troubling picture of his employer's activities. There were the late-night visits that Mr. Thornton made to the property, always alone and always to areas that were supposedly restricted for wildlife protection. There were the deliveries that arrived at odd hours, trucks that left no paperwork and carried cargo that was never inventoried in any of the official records Bobby was required to maintain. Most disturbing of all were the conversations Bobby had overheard during the few occasions when Mr. Thornton had brought associates to the reserve. Discussions about temporary storage, discreet disposal, and keeping things quiet that had nothing to do with wildlife conservation and everything to do with activities that Bobby suspected would not stand up to legal scrutiny. As he pulled on his boots and reached for the heavy-duty flashlight he kept by his door, Bobby reflected on the moral dilemma that had been growing heavier with each passing month. He needed this job. The salary was generous, the work was meaningful in many ways, and at his age, finding comparable employment would be challenging. But his conscience was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, especially as he witnessed the genuine good that the reserve did for the animals in its care. The sound came again, more distant now, but still unmistakably the call of a dog in distress. Bobby had encountered Max numerous times over the past 3 years, always from a distance, and always with the sense that the German Shepherd was more afraid of humans than aggressive toward them. The dog's presence on the reserve had never been officially acknowledged, but Bobby had left food and water in strategic locations, understanding instinctively that Max was another of the secrets that surrounded the Thornton property. Bobby stepped out into the humid night air and began walking toward the sound, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he followed familiar trails through the dense forest. The reserve's trail system was extensive, designed originally to accommodate researchers and later expanded to provide access for the various maintenance activities required to keep the property functioning. Bobby knew every path, every landmark, and every hiding place within the 1,000-acre sanctuary. As he walked, Bobby's mind wandered to the other secrets he had discovered during his years on the property. The modified storage buildings that had been constructed without proper permits, the sophisticated security system that monitored areas supposedly dedicated to wildlife observation, the periodic visits from men in expensive suits who clearly had no interest in environmental conservation, but seemed very interested in the reserve's more remote locations. 20 minutes into his walk, Bobby's flashlight illuminated tire tracks in the soft earth near the old research building. Fresh tracks, made within the last hour or two, leading directly to the building that Mr. Thornton had explicitly told him was off-limits due to structural concerns. Bobby felt his pulse quicken as he considered the implications. Mr. Thornton was here tonight, in the one place on the property where Bobby was specifically forbidden to go. The sound of voices carried through the night air, too distant for Bobby to make out individual words, but clear enough to confirm that there were people near the building. Bobby crept closer, using the dense undergrowth as cover while he tried to assess the situation. His years of experience as a park ranger had taught him how to move quietly through the forest, and he was able to get within 50 yards of the clearing before the scene before him brought him to a complete stop. In the pale glow of expensive car headlights, Bobby could see Mr. Thornton standing next to a young girl who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. The child was holding a thin blanket and appeared to be scared and confused. Between them and the forest stood Max, the German Shepherd, in what was clearly a protective stance. And at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the shadows, Bobby caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Luna, the black panther that Bobby had encountered twice before in his years on the reserve, was crouched in the darkness, her attention focused on the humans and the dog, with an intensity that suggested she was evaluating whether they represented a threat or an opportunity. Bobby had never reported his previous sightings of the panther to Mr. Thornton, partly because he wasn't entirely sure what he had seen, and partly because he suspected that the big cat's presence on the reserve was yet another secret that his employer preferred to keep hidden. Bobby's mind raced as he tried to process what he was witnessing. A terrified child, an abandoned dog, a dangerous predator, and his employer in the middle of it all at 2 o'clock in the morning. Nothing about the scene made sense from the perspective of legitimate wildlife conservation, and everything about it suggested that Mr. Thornton was involved in something that went far beyond questionable business practices. The child's voice carried clearly through the still night air as she spoke to Mr. Thornton about giving food to Max. Her compassion for the obviously malnourished dog was evident even from Bobby's distant position, and her concern for the animal's welfare stood in stark contrast to the fear and confusion that marked her other words. Whatever had brought her to this remote location, it clearly wasn't her choice. Bobby found himself faced with a decision that would define not only his own future, but potentially the futures of everyone in the clearing before him. He could retreat to his cabin, pretend he had never seen anything, and continue collecting his salary while turning a blind eye to activities that his conscience could no longer ignore. Or he could step forward, reveal his presence, and demand answers to questions that might put his own safety at risk. As he crouched in the undergrowth, weighing his options, Bobby became aware of another sound in the distance, the rumble of an approaching engine, still several minutes away, but clearly heading in their direction. Someone else was coming to the reserve, and at this hour, Bobby doubted it was anyone with legitimate business. The complexity of the situation was growing by the minute, and Bobby realized that whatever was happening here tonight was likely just the tip of an iceberg that could destroy multiple lives if it wasn't handled carefully. The child's safety had to be the primary concern, but the presence of the panther added a level of danger that could turn deadly in seconds if anyone made the wrong move. Bobby's hand found the satellite phone he carried for emergencies, but he hesitated before activating it. Calling for help would bring authorities to the reserve, and while that might protect the child, it would also expose Mr. Thornton's secrets in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. The local sheriff's department had always maintained a cordial relationship with Mr. Thornton, partly due to his generous donations to various law enforcement charities and partly due to his influence in county politics. The approaching engine grew louder, and Bobby realized that time was running out for him to make his decision. He could continue to observe from the shadows, waiting to see how events unfolded, or he could take action to protect an innocent child who clearly needed help. Looking at the small figure clutching her blanket in the eerie glow of the headlights, Surrounded by wild animals and an employer whose true nature was becoming increasingly clear, Bobby knew that his choice had already been made. The approaching vehicle belonged to Jake Morrison, a local man whose reputation in the surrounding counties was built on his willingness to ignore both environmental regulations and common sense in pursuit of profit. Jake had spent the better part of 20 years making his living from activities that existed in the gray areas between legal hunting and outright poaching, always managing to stay just ahead of the law enforcement officers who occasionally took interest in his operations. Tonight, Jake was driving his modified pickup truck through the back roads that bordered the Thornton Wildlife Reserve, following rumors he had heard at Murphy's Tavern about unusual animal activity in the area. The conversation had started innocently, enough, with local hunters sharing stories about strange tracks and unexplained sounds coming from the direction of the reserve. But Jake's experienced ear had picked up details that suggested something more valuable than the usual deer and turkey that populated most of North Carolina's forests. Jake had been hearing whispers about the Thornton Reserve for months, stories that suggested Mr. Thornton's wildlife conservation efforts might include species that were worth considerably more than their conservation value would suggest. A black panther, if the rumors were true, would represent a payday that could set Jake up comfortably for several years. The exotic animal trade was dangerous and highly illegal, but it was also extremely lucrative for those willing to take the risks. As his truck rumbled along the dirt road that led to the reserve's perimeter, Jake reviewed his equipment and his plan. The tranquilizer gun was loaded and ready, powerful enough to drop a big cat without causing permanent harm. The reinforced cage in his truck bed was designed to transport large predators safely and quietly. Most importantly, Jake had cultivated relationships with buyers who asked no questions and paid in cash for rare specimens. What Jake didn't know was that his activities had been observed and reported by Bobby Hayes on numerous occasions over the past year. The caretaker had documented Jake's presence on the reserve's borders, had photographed his modified truck, and had even managed to capture images of some of Jake's illegal hunting activities using the trail cameras that were scattered throughout the property. Bobby had been building a file on Jake Morrison for months, part of his growing collection of evidence related to various illegal activities that seemed to orbit around the Thornton Reserve like satellites around a planet. The file included dates, times, photographs, and detailed notes about Jake's movements and methods. Bobby had been planning to turn the information over to the state wildlife officials, but the complex web of corruption and influence that surrounded Mr. Thornton had made him cautious about trusting official channels. Meanwhile, in the clearing, near the old research building, William Thornton was becoming increasingly aware that his carefully controlled situation was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. The approaching engine sound was growing louder, and he recognized the distinctive rumble of Jake Morrison's truck. William had been paying Jake for various discreet services for over a year, using him to handle problems that required someone with flexible ethics and no concern for legal niceties. But tonight, Jake's arrival represented a complication that William hadn't anticipated. Sarah's presence changed everything about the situation, and William found himself caught between his need to maintain control and his unexpected desire to protect the frightened child who had somehow become central to his problems. Sarah had managed to coax Max closer by offering him pieces of an energy bar that William had retrieved from his car. The German shepherd was clearly starving, his ribs visible through his matted coat, and his gratitude for the small offering was both heartbreaking and accusatory. As Sarah gently stroked the dog's scarred head, she looked up at William with eyes that seemed far too wise for her young age. "He remembers you," she said quietly, her observation delivered with the casual certainty that only children possess. "He's been waiting for you to come back for him." Her words hit William like a physical blow, stripping away the rationalizations he had built around his decision to abandon Max 3 years earlier. Luna, the Panther, had moved closer during Sarah's interaction with Max, her curiosity apparently overcoming her natural caution. The big cat remained at a safe distance, but her attention was clearly focused on the human child who showed no fear of the scarred dog. There was something almost protective in Luna's posture, as if she too recognized Sarah's innocence and felt compelled to guard it. The sound of Jake's truck was now close enough that William could see the glow of headlights through the trees. In moments, Jake would arrive in the clearing, and William would be forced to explain Sarah's presence to a man whose moral flexibility had limits that didn't extend to harming children. Jake Morrison might be a poacher and a criminal, but he had never shown any inclination toward violence against innocent people. William's mind raced as he considered his options. He could try to hide Sarah before Jake arrived, but the presence of Max and Luna would make any sudden movements dangerous. He could attempt to send Jake away, but that would require explanations that William wasn't prepared to give. Most problematically, he could sense that events were moving beyond his ability to control, and Sarah's safety was becoming dependent on factors that were outside his influence. From his hidden position in the forest, Bobby Hayes watched the scene unfold with growing alarm. The approaching vehicle could only belong to Jake Morrison, whose presence would add a level of danger and unpredictability that could turn the already volatile situation into something far worse. Bobby had seen Jake's casual cruelty toward animals, had witnessed his willingness to use violence when it served his purposes, and he knew that the poacher's arrival would shift the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Bobby's hand closed around his satellite phone again, but he still hesitated to make the call that would bring outside help. The local authorities' complicated relationship with William Thornton meant that any intervention might not protect Sarah and could actually make her situation worse. But as Jake's headlights became visible through the trees, Bobby realized that inaction was no longer an option. Sarah seemed to sense the change in atmosphere as the sound of the approaching truck grew louder. Max's protective stance became more pronounced, and even Luna shifted into a more alert position at the edge of the clearing. The child's natural instincts were telling her that something dangerous was approaching, and she moved closer to William, seeking protection from the adult who had brought her to this frightening place. "Mr. Thornton," Sarah whispered, her small hand finding his sleeve. "I'm scared. Who's coming?" Her trust in him, despite everything, was almost more than William could bear. He had built his adult life on the principle that emotions were weaknesses to be suppressed and managed, but this frightened child was forcing him to confront feelings that he had spent years avoiding. Jake's truck entered the clearing with a roar of engine noise and a spray of gravel, the powerful headlights temporarily blinding everyone present. As the dust settled and the engine noise faded, Jake Morrison climbed out of his cab with the casual confidence of a man who was accustomed to taking what he wanted, regardless of the consequences. Jake was a large man, his arms marked with tattoos that told stories of violence and rebellion. His eyes immediately took in the unusual scene before him. A wealthy businessman, a frightened child, a scarred German shepherd, and somewhere in the shadows, the Black Panther that represented the reason for his visit. For a moment, even Jake seemed taken aback by the complexity of what he was witnessing. "Well, well," Jake said, his voice carrying a mixture of amusement and calculation. "This is a lot more interesting than I expected, Mr. Thornton." His gaze moved from William to Sarah and back again, and William could see Jake's quick mind working to understand how the various pieces of the puzzle fit together. The clearing fell silent, except for the ticking of cooling engines and the ever-present sounds of the forest around them. 4 humans, 2 wild animals, and secrets that could destroy multiple lives were now gathered in a space barely large enough to contain the tension that crackled between them. William realized that the next few minutes would determine whether the situation could be resolved quietly or whether events would spiral into chaos that would leave everyone's life forever changed. The tension in the clearing was palpable as Jake Morrison's calculating gaze moved between William, Sarah, and the animals that surrounded them. Jake had expected to find a panther he could capture and sell, but the presence of a terrified child complicated his plans in ways that even his flexible morality couldn't easily accommodate. Despite his criminal activities, Jake had always maintained certain boundaries, and harming children was a line he had never crossed. "You want to explain what's going on here, Thornton?" Jake asked, his voice carrying a note of suspicion that hadn't been there during their previous business dealings. "Because this doesn't look like the simple wildlife management issue you described when you called me." William felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. He had called Jake earlier that evening to handle what he had described as a problem animal on the reserve, but he had never mentioned Sarah's involvement in the situation. Now, faced with Jake's obvious confusion and the child's frightened presence, William realized that his carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling with frightening speed. "The situation has become more complicated than I anticipated," William said, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos of his thoughts. "The child's presence here is unexpected." Even as he spoke the words, William knew how inadequate they sounded. There was no innocent explanation for bringing an 8-year-old girl to a remote location in the middle of the night, especially not in the company of dangerous predators. Sarah pressed closer to William's side, her young mind trying to process the threatening atmosphere that surrounded the new arrival. Max sensed her increased fear and moved to position himself between Sarah and Jake, his protective instincts overriding his natural wariness of humans. The German shepherd's scarred body was tense with readiness, and his intelligent eyes never left Jake's face. From her position at the edge of the clearing, Luna watched the interaction with the patient intensity of a predator evaluating a complex hunting situation. The panther's golden eyes reflected the various light sources as she calculated distances and escape routes, her powerful muscles coiled and ready to respond to any sudden movement. Jake's attention was drawn to the panther's gleaming eyes, and William could see the dollar signs practically lighting up in the poacher's mind. Luna represented a significant payday, but her proximity to a child created tactical problems that Jake was still working through. His tranquilizer gun was powerful enough to drop the big cat quickly, but in the confined space of the clearing, with unpredictable variables like the protective dog and the frightened child, any action he took carried significant risks. "Listen, Thornton," Jake said, taking a step closer to William while keeping his eyes on Luna. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but that cat is worth a fortune to the right buyers. If you want me to handle this situation discreetly, we need to get the kid out of here before someone gets hurt." William's mind raced as he considered his options. Jake's presence had been intended to solve one problem, but it was rapidly creating several new ones. The poacher's suggestion about removing Sarah from the immediate danger zone was tactically sound, but it would also mean trusting Jake Morrison with knowledge that could destroy William's carefully constructed public image. It was at that moment that the sound of another approaching vehicle shattered the fragile equilibrium of the clearing. This time, the engine noise was different, the distinctive rumble of an older pickup truck being driven with urgent purpose. William's heart sank as he recognized the sound. Bobby Hayes was approaching, and the caretaker's arrival would add yet another unpredictable element to an already volatile situation. From his position in the forest, Bobby had been watching the confrontation unfold with growing concern. Jake Morrison's arrival had confirmed his worst fears about the direction events were taking, and the poacher's obvious interest in Luna meant that violence was becoming increasingly likely. Bobby's years of experience had taught him that situations involving scared children, dangerous animals, and men with criminal intentions rarely ended well without immediate intervention. Bobby's truck entered the clearing with less drama than Jake's arrival, but the caretaker's presence immediately changed the dynamic of the confrontation. As a longtime employee who knew many of William's secrets, Bobby represented a threat to the wealthy businessman's attempts to control the narrative. More importantly, Bobby's genuine concern for both wildlife and human safety made him an unpredictable factor in William's calculations. "Mr. Thornton," Bobby said as he climbed out of his truck, his voice carrying the respectful tone he had always used with his employer, despite his growing suspicions about the man's activities. "I heard some commotion and thought I should check to make sure everything was all right." His eyes took in the scene before him, the frightened child, the protective dog, the lurking panther, and Jake Morrison's predatory presence, and Bobby's expression hardened with understanding. Jake recognized Bobby immediately, having encountered the caretaker during several of his previous intrusions onto the reserve property. The two men had never directly confronted each other, but there had been enough near misses over the years to establish a mutual recognition of their incompatible purposes. Bobby's arrival meant that Jake's plans for a quick and quiet capture of the Panther were now essentially impossible. "Hayes," Jake acknowledged with a nod that carried more threat than greeting. "Funny how many people seem to be out and about tonight." His hand moved casually toward the tranquilizer gun mounted in his truck, a gesture that Bobby noted with growing alarm. Sarah looked between the three men, her young mind struggling to understand the complex undercurrents of tension that filled the clearing. Max remained positioned protectively near her, but his attention was now divided between the various human threats and the panther that continued to observe from the shadows. The German shepherd's years of survival in the wild had taught him to recognize dangerous situations, and every instinct he possessed was screaming warnings about the volatile mix of personalities that surrounded them. "Mr. Thornton," Bobby said, his voice carrying a note of carefully controlled anger, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what's really going on here. This child needs to be somewhere safe, and these animals deserve better than being caught in the middle of whatever business arrangements you've been making." William felt the walls closing in around him as Bobby's words stripped away the pretenses he had been trying to maintain. The caretaker's knowledge of his activities, combined with Jake's obvious confusion and Sarah's terrified presence, created a perfect storm of circumstances that threatened to expose everything he had worked to hide. It was then that the fourth vehicle of the night made its appearance, announcing its arrival with the determined rumble of an engine being pushed beyond its normal limits. This time, William's face went completely pale as he recognized the sound. The approaching vehicle belonged to someone whose arrival would shatter any remaining hope he had of controlling the situation. Jessica Martinez had been driving through the night, following a trail of clues and intuition that had led her back to North Carolina after 2 years of searching for answers about her missing daughter. Her return to the area had been prompted by a series of anonymous tips that had suggested Sarah was in danger and that William Thornton was somehow involved in her disappearance. As Jessica's battered sedan entered the clearing, its headlights illuminating the surreal tableau of humans and animals that had gathered around the old research building, she felt her heart stop. There, pressed against William Thornton's side, and surrounded by more danger than any child should ever face, was Sarah, alive, frightened, but unmistakably her daughter. "Sarah." Jessica's cry cut through the night air like a blade as she threw herself out of her car without even turning off the engine. The sound of her mother's voice caused Sarah to spin around, her face lighting up with joy and relief despite the fear that had dominated her expression for hours. "Mommy!" Sarah broke away from William's side and ran toward Jessica, her thin blanket trailing behind her as she covered the distance between them in seconds. The reunion was explosive with emotion, Jessica dropping to her knees to catch her daughter in an embrace that spoke of 2 years of separation, fear, and desperate hope. Max, confused by the sudden movement but recognizing the joy in Sarah's voice, followed the child toward her mother, his tail wagging for the first time in years. Even Luna seemed affected by the emotional reunion, her predatory tension relaxing slightly as she observed the obvious love between mother and child. The arrival of Sarah's mother transformed the entire situation, shifting the focus from William's business problems to the far more fundamental question of how a missing child had ended up in a remote wildlife preserve in the middle of the night. Jake Morrison found himself witnessing a family reunion that made his criminal intentions seem suddenly petty and wrong. Bobby Hayes felt a surge of relief that Sarah was no longer alone and unprotected, but also a growing anger at the circumstances that had led to this moment. William Thornton stood frozen in the center of the clearing, watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him as the truth he had spent 2 years hiding finally came to light in the most dramatic way possible. The night that was supposed to solve his problems had instead created new ones that would reshape the lives of everyone present. Jessica held Sarah tightly against her chest, tears streaming down her face as she felt the solid reality of her daughter's presence after 2 years of not knowing whether she was alive or safe. The reunion was everything she had dreamed of during countless sleepless nights, but the circumstances surrounding it filled her with a rage that burned white-hot in her chest. As she looked up from her daughter's face to meet William Thornton's eyes across the clearing, Jessica's expression carried a fury that made even Jake Morrison take a step backward. "Where has she been, William?" Jessica's voice was deadly quiet, carrying the kind of controlled anger that was far more dangerous than screaming. "Where has my daughter been for 2 years while you've been playing the concerned family friend, helping with the search efforts and donating money to the reward fund?" William felt the weight of everyone's stares as the full scope of his deception became clear to the assembled group. Bobby Hayes, who had suspected his employer of various illegal activities, found himself confronting evidence of something far worse than financial crimes. Jake Morrison, whose own moral compass was hardly reliable, looked at William with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Even Max seemed to sense the shift in the clearing's emotional landscape, his protective stance now directed as much against William as toward any external threats. "Jessica, you don't understand the complexity of the situation," William began, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "There were circumstances, legal complications, that made it impossible to—" "Stop lying!" Jessica's voice cracked like a whip, cutting through William's attempt at rationalization. 2 years, William. 2 years I've been searching for my daughter, while you knew exactly where she was. 2 years of police reports and missing persons investigations and sleepless nights. And you knew." Sarah, still clinging to her mother but beginning to understand the gravity of the conversation happening around her, looked up at Jessica with confusion clouding her young features. "Mommy, why are you angry at Mr. Thornton? He's been taking care of me. He said you were sick and couldn't see me for a while." The lie hit Jessica like a physical blow, and she struggled to maintain her composure for Sarah's sake while fury built inside her like a storm. William had not only taken her daughter, but had convinced the child that her own mother was somehow incapable of caring for her. The manipulation was so complete, so calculated, that Jessica found herself momentarily speechless with rage. Bobby Hayes, whose suspicions about his employer had been building for months, felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. In his mind, the legal troubles that had plagued William's business empire 2 years ago, the mysterious disappearance of Jessica Martinez from her job at William's company, and now the revelation that her daughter had been hidden away on the reserve all along. The caretaker's face hardened as he realized he had been unknowingly complicit in a scheme that went far beyond the financial crimes he had suspected. "Mr. Thornton," Bobby said, his voice carrying a note of moral authority that surprised everyone. "Present, I think it's time you told us the truth about what happened 2 years ago, all of it." Jake Morrison found himself in the unusual position of being the least morally compromised person in the clearing, a realization that made him profoundly uncomfortable. His criminal activities were motivated by greed and a disregard for laws that he considered inconvenient, but they had never involved harming children or destroying families. Looking at the reunion between Jessica and Sarah, Jake felt something that might have been conscience stirring in his chest. Luna, the Panther, had retreated further into the shadows as the human emotions in the clearing intensified, her predatory instincts telling her that the real danger now came from the volatile mix of anger, guilt, and revelation that filled the air. Max, however, seemed drawn to Jessica and Sarah, perhaps recognizing in their reunion an echo of the loyalty and love that had been absent from his own life for so long. William looked around the clearing at the faces surrounding him and realized that his carefully constructed world was completely beyond salvation. The truth was going to come out, and no amount of money or influence was going to change that fact. His shoulders sagged as the weight of 2 years of deception finally became too heavy to carry. "Jessica worked for my company," William began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She discovered discrepancies in our environmental compliance reports, irregularities that would have triggered federal investigations if they had been reported to the proper authorities. When she threatened to go to the EPA, I made the mistake of thinking I could control the situation through intimidation." Jessica's grip on Sarah tightened as she listened to William's confession, her memory filling in the details he was reluctant to share. The threatening phone calls that had started after she had questioned certain financial reports, the break-in at her apartment that had occurred just days after she had copied sensitive documents, the escalating pressure that had made her fear for her safety, and more importantly, for Sarah's safety. "You had me followed," Jessica said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had finally found confirmation for suspicions that had haunted her for years. "You had people watching my apartment, monitoring my phone calls, making sure I knew that you could reach me anywhere I went." William nodded reluctantly, unable to meet her eyes. "I hired private security contractors to keep tabs on your activities. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I could find a way to resolve the compliance issues without triggering a federal investigation. But then you disappeared with Sarah, and everything spiraled out of control." "I didn't disappear," Jessica said, her voice rising with indignation. "I ran for our lives because your people made it clear that neither Sarah nor I would be safe if I didn't keep quiet about what I had discovered. I took my daughter and went into hiding because I was terrified that you would hurt her to keep me silent." Bobby Hayes, who had been listening to the exchange with growing understanding, stepped forward with a question that had been nagging at him. If Jessica ran away with Sarah to protect her, how did the child end up here on the reserve? And why has she been here for 2 years without anyone knowing? William's silence stretched uncomfortably as he struggled with how much of the truth to reveal. The full story would expose not only his business crimes, but also the network of corrupt officials and compromised law enforcement personnel who had helped him maintain his cover. But looking at Sarah's confused face and Jessica's righteous anger, he realized that partial truths would no longer be sufficient. When Jessica disappeared with Sarah, I used my connections in law enforcement to have her declared a kidnapping suspect, William admitted, his voice heavy with shame. I convinced the authorities that Jessica had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and had taken Sarah to harm her. It wasn't difficult to sell the story, given Jessica's erratic behavior in the weeks before she left. Jessica's face went white. As the full scope of William's manipulation became clear, "You made me look like a criminal for protecting my own daughter. You had me listed as a kidnapping suspect so that I couldn't come forward without being arrested. The private investigators I hired eventually tracked you down to that motel in Tennessee," William continued, his confession gaining momentum, as if sharing the burden of his secrets was somehow relieving the pressure that had been building inside him for years. "When they took Sarah, they were supposed to turn her over to Child Protective Services, but I realized that if she went into the system, there would be questions, investigations, paperwork that might lead back to me." Sarah, who had been listening to the adult conversation with growing confusion and fear, looked up at her mother with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Mommy, I don't understand. Why are you and Mr. Thornton fighting? Where were you? Why didn't you come to get me?" Jessica's heart broke as she realized that her daughter had spent 2 years believing that her mother had abandoned her voluntarily. The careful manipulation that William had employed to keep Sarah compliant and quiet had involved convincing the child that her mother was either unable or unwilling to care for her properly. "Sweetheart," Jessica said, her voice gentle despite the fury that burned in her chest, "I never stopped looking for you, not for a single day. Mr. Thornton took you away from me and told you things that weren't true to make you think I didn't want you anymore." Max, who had been observing the human drama with the patient intelligence that had allowed him to survive in the wild for 3 years, approached Sarah and gently nuzzled her hand. The gesture seemed to comfort the confused child, and she reached out to stroke the German Shepherd's scarred head while trying to process the revelations that were reshaping her understanding of her own life. Jake Morrison, who had been listening to the confession with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "Look, Thornton, I came here tonight expecting to handle a simple business transaction. I didn't sign up to be part of whatever this twisted situation is. That little girl needs to be with her mother, and these animals need to be left alone." Bobby Hayes nodded in agreement with Jake's assessment, despite his distrust of the poacher's motives in other matters. "Mr. Thornton, I've been working for you for 8 years, and I've overlooked a lot of questionable activities because I needed the job, and because I believed you were doing some genuine good with the wildlife conservation work. But this crosses every line I can think of." William looked around the clearing, at the faces of the people whose lives he had manipulated and damaged, and for the first time in years, he felt the full weight of his actions settling on his shoulders, like a crushing burden. The business empire he had built through corruption and intimidation was crumbling, but that seemed insignificant compared to the harm he had caused to an innocent family. "What happens now?" William asked, his voice carrying a note of defeat that surprised everyone present. For a man who had spent his entire adult life believing that money and influence could solve any problem, the realization that some damages couldn't be repaired was devastating. Jessica stood slowly, still holding Sarah protectively against her side, and looked at William with an expression that mixed pity with contempt. "Now we go home, Sarah and I, and then we start rebuilding the life that you stole from us." 3 months after that transformative night at the Thornton Wildlife Reserve, the September morning sun filtered through the windows of Jessica and Sarah's new apartment in Asheville, North Carolina. The modest two-bedroom unit was a far cry from the spacious house they had shared before William's machinations had torn their lives apart. But it felt like a palace to Jessica because it represented something that had been stolen from them: freedom, safety, and the simple joy of being together. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, carefully coloring a picture she had drawn of Max, the German shepherd who had become an unexpected hero in their story. The dog's image dominated the page, rendered in Sarah's childish but earnest style, surrounded by trees and flowers that represented the new life they were building together. On the refrigerator nearby, dozens of similar drawings created a gallery of memories from their time of separation and reunion. "Mummy, can we visit Max today?" Sarah asked, looking up from her artwork with hopeful eyes. "I want to show him the picture I made." But as Jessica smiled as she poured orange juice into Sarah's favorite cup, one decorated with butterflies that they had picked out together during their first shopping trip after being reunited. "Of course, sweetheart. Bobby said Max has been asking about you too." It was a small fiction, but one that brought joy to Sarah's face and reflected a deeper truth about the bond that had formed between the child and the scarred dog who had protected her during the most frightening night of her young life. The legal proceedings that had followed their reunion had been complex and emotionally draining, but they had ultimately resulted in justice for the Martinez family and consequences for those who had participated in William's schemes. William himself had pled guilty to charges of conspiracy, fraud, and child endangerment, accepting a plea bargain that would send him to federal prison for 12 years. His cooperation with federal investigators had exposed a network of corruption that reached into multiple state agencies and local law enforcement departments. Bobby Hayes had emerged from the scandal as something of a local hero, his detailed documentation of illegal activities on the reserve, providing prosecutors with evidence that had been crucial to building their case. The state had appointed him as the new director of what was now called the Carolina Wildlife Sanctuary, allowing him to continue his conservation work while ensuring that the facility operated with complete transparency and legitimate oversight. Jake Morrison's role in the night's events had proven to be more complicated than anyone had initially realized. While his presence at the reserve had been motivated by criminal intentions, his decision to step away from his planned poaching activities after witnessing the family reunion had marked a turning point in his life. Facing federal charges related to his illegal hunting activities, Jake had accepted a plea agreement that included community service at the wildlife sanctuary, where his knowledge of local animal behavior had proven surprisingly valuable to legitimate conservation efforts. The truth is, Bobby had told Jessica during one of their recent conversations, Jake knows these animals better than anyone I've ever met. He's been tracking and observing them for years, even if his intentions weren't always pure. Now that he's using that knowledge to help instead of harm, he's become one of our most effective wildlife rehabilitation specialists. Luna, the Black Panther whose presence had added such drama to that night 3 months ago, had been relocated to a specialized facility in Florida where she could live safely while contributing to breeding programs designed to preserve endangered species. Her departure from the reserve had been emotional for everyone involved, but particularly for Bobby, who had grown genuinely fond of the magnificent predator during his years as caretaker. Max's transformation had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. Under Bobby's care and with regular visits from Sarah, the German shepherd had gradually regained both his physical health and his trust in humans. The scars that covered his body would never fully fade, but they had become marks of survival, rather than symbols of abandonment. Sarah's unconditional love and Bobby's patient care had given Max something he had thought lost forever: a family. You know, Jessica said as she sat down across from Sarah at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking about something. Bobby mentioned that Max might be happier if he had a permanent home instead of just living at the sanctuary. What do you think about asking if he could come live with us?" Sarah's face lit up with an expression of pure joy that reminded Jessica of all the reasons she had fought so hard to get her daughter back. "Really, Mommy? Max could live here with us?" The excitement in her voice was infectious, and Jessica found herself smiling as she imagined the German shepherd stretched out on their living room floor, finally safe and loved after years of struggle. "We'd have to make sure our landlord is okay with pets, and we'd need to puppy-proof the apartment," Jessica said, already making mental lists of the preparations that would be necessary. "But I think Max deserves a real home, don't you?" The financial settlement that had resulted from the legal proceedings had provided Jessica and Sarah with enough money to rebuild their lives comfortably, though Jessica had insisted that the majority of the funds be placed in a trust for Sarah's education. William's assets had been liquidated to provide restitution to his victims and to fund legitimate wildlife conservation efforts, ensuring that some good would come from the wreckage of his criminal empire. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the therapist who had been working with Sarah to help her process the trauma of her separation from her mother, had been encouraged by the child's progress in recent weeks. "Sarah's resilience is remarkable," she had told Jessica during their last session. "Children have an amazing capacity for healing when they feel safe and loved. The most important thing now is maintaining the stability and security that you've worked so hard to provide." The healing process hadn't been easy for either of them. Sarah had struggled with nightmares and anxiety attacks in the weeks following their reunion, and Jessica had battled her own demons related to the guilt and helplessness she had felt during their separation. But with professional help, family support, and the simple passage of time, they had both begun to rebuild their sense of security and trust in the world. "Mommy," Sarah said, putting down her crayon and looking at Jessica with the serious expression she sometimes wore when asking important questions, "do you think Mr. Thornton is sorry for what he did?" Jessica considered the question carefully, wanting to give her daughter an honest answer while protecting her from the full complexity of adult motivations and consequences. "I think he is sorry, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices because they're scared or confused, and then they have to live with the consequences of those choices. Mr. Thornton hurt our family very badly, but I believe he understands that what he did was wrong. I hope he learns to make better choices," Sarah said with the generous spirit that never failed to amaze Jessica. "Maybe when he gets out of prison, he can help animals like Bobby does." The community of Asheville had embraced Jessica and Sarah with warmth and support that had helped make their transition to a new life smoother than either of them had dared to hope. Sarah's new school had been understanding about her unique circumstances, providing additional counseling support and working with Jessica to ensure that the child felt safe and secure in her educational environment. Jessica had found work with a local environmental consulting firm, using her expertise in regulatory compliance to help businesses operate within environmental protection laws. The irony of her new career path wasn't lost on her. She was now helping companies do legally what William had tried to accomplish through corruption and intimidation. As they prepared for their afternoon visit to the sanctuary, Jessica reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this point. The night that had seemed like their darkest hour had ultimately become the beginning of their healing and the exposure of truths that needed to be revealed. Max's protection of Sarah in the forest, Bobby's courage in standing up to his corrupt employer, and even Jake's moment of moral clarity had all contributed to a resolution that none of them could have anticipated. "Are you ready to go see Max?" Jessica asked, gathering her keys and purse, while Sarah carefully placed her drawing in a protective folder. "Yes," Sarah replied, practically bouncing with excitement. "And Mommy, can we ask Bobby if Luna is happy in her new home? I miss her even though she was scary." "Of course we can ask about Luna," Jessica assured her daughter as they headed for the door. "Bobby keeps in touch with the people at her new sanctuary, so he'll have news about how she's doing." As they walked to their car, Jessica felt a profound sense of gratitude for the second chance they had been given. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, and there would undoubtedly be challenges and setbacks as they continued to heal from their ordeal. But they were together, they were safe, and they had a community of people who cared about their well-being. The drive to the Carolina Wildlife Sanctuary took them through the beautiful North Carolina countryside, past rolling hills and forests, that reminded Jessica of the resilience of nature itself. Like the animals that Bobby and his team worked to rehabilitate, she and Sarah were learning to trust again, to build new lives from the fragments of what had been taken from them. When they arrived at the sanctuary, Max was waiting by the fence as if he had somehow sensed their approach. His tail wagged with genuine joy as Sarah ran to greet him, and Jessica watched with a full heart as her daughter and the dog who had protected her were reunited once again. Bobby emerged from one of the rehabilitation buildings with a smile that reflected his own satisfaction with the new direction his life had taken. "How are my favorite visitors today?" he called out, approaching them with the easy confidence of a man who had found his true calling. "We're wonderful," Jessica replied, and as she spoke the words, she realized that they were completely true. After 2 years of fear, uncertainty, and separation, they were finally genuinely wonderful. Looking around at the thriving sanctuary with its dedicated staff, recovering animals, and legitimate mission of wildlife protection, Jessica felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced since before William's crimes had shattered their lives. The story that had begun with abandonment and deception had evolved into something beautiful, a tale of resilience, redemption, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest circumstances. As Sarah played with Max in the afternoon sunshine, laughing with pure joy as the German shepherd gently wrestled with her for a stick they had found, Jessica knew that their story would continue to unfold in ways that honored both their painful past and their hopeful future. They had survived the worst that life could throw at them, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more grateful for the simple blessings that others might take for granted. The Carolina Wildlife Sanctuary stood as a testament to the possibility of transformation and renewal, a place where damaged creatures could heal and find new purpose. In many ways, it perfectly represented the journey that Jessica and Sarah had taken together, proving that even in the darkest forests, love and courage could light the way home. Dear friends, we hope that Jessica and Sarah's incredible journey of survival, love, and redemption has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. Their story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, the bonds of family and the kindness of unexpected allies can guide us toward healing and hope. If this tale of courage in the face of adversity moved you, we invite you to explore our collection of similar stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. You can find our complete playlist of heartwarming narratives by clicking the link here on your screen. Each story we share explores the complex emotions and relationships that define our lives, offering both entertainment and inspiration for those who need reminding that every ending can become a new beginning. If Jessica and Sarah's story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a thumbs up to help us reach others who might find comfort and hope in these tales. We bring you new stories every day, each one carefully crafted to explore the depths of human experience and the power of love to overcome adversity. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories connect with your own experiences and what lessons you take from each character's journey. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to sharing many more inspiring stories with you in the days to come.